Now, before we begin, only like 3% of people are subscribed, so please show some appreciation, follow the channel. There's some brilliant videos on Bohurt, medieval history, saints, my book and myself, so please let's turn that 90% unsubscribed into 90% subscribed. Thank you, and let's jump straight in. If I was to say that Guibert of Nogent was crucial in understanding medieval Europe in the 12th century, many would ask who he even is, let alone his impact. This is a fair estimation, as Guibert himself led a fairly quiet and solitary life. Yet, the 12th century is marked by a bustling melting pot of intellect, especially in France, with powerful minds like Suger of St-Denis, Ivo of Chartres, Heloise, Abelard, Galbert of Bruge, to name a few. For us, however, Guibert has done perhaps more than any of these other characters of the 12th century in shaping our understanding of power, belief, and of course, saints. For a time, he studied alongside Anselm of Bec, one of the greatest philosophical minds, and Archbishop of Canterbury, who would later become a saint in his own right. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of Guibert is that he was present at Pope Urban II's Council of Clermont, and thus he wrote one of the most influential texts on the First Crusade. Nevertheless, Guibert also wrote about the Old Testament and Genesis, but for the interest of today, we turn towards On the Relics of Saints, written in 1119. Now, On the Relics of Saints is not a widely publicised book. In fact, it is only found in one edition in the 12th century that was written by Guibert's own hand and most probably never ventured further than the church it was written in. Nevertheless, the words within these pages unveil one of the most striking and original narratives of the 12th century. He does not state to know all the answers, and he is deeply emotive in his writing, but this all aids us in understanding how this century, known as the Age of Intellect, saw people question good and evil, the theories and workings of the world, and above all, the nature of saints and their relics. Now, relics were a particular point of interest in the 12th century, as by this time there were thousands of them that featured heavily across the continent in worship traditions and pilgrimages. So, now what's most interesting is that this came about by Guibert at the monastery of Saint-Médard, which was about 10 miles from where Guibert was at Nogent. Now, this monastery claimed to have an ancient relic that was the baby tooth of Christ. Founded in the 6th century, the ancient church of Saint-Médard had played a pivotal role in some of history's greatest events. Now, it was, for example, the place where Louis the Pious, the son of Charlemagne, was imprisoned when he was being deposed. With this in mind, it seems strange to Guibert that a site which was wealthier and more powerful than that of Nogent would claim to have something so absurd. As such, there is skepticism with Guibert's tone, as he writes, "There exist, on the other hand, certain practices that we hold that are preached in churches. Although they do not figure among the things that we must do for our salvation and without which we cannot live rightly, many might live out their lives well without receiving any help from these practices, and in fact, many do live their lives well without them. Such is the case with saints' bodies and their relics. We ought to revere and honour the relics, both because of the saints' examples and the protection they provide. But we must have truly sound evidence as to the authenticity of these relics, such that someone is called a saint only if there is true tradition of antiquity about his saintliness, or else if true writings, not mere opinion, confirms it." In other words, he's pondering here the utility of saints and relics, if Mass, and more so the Eucharist, already exists. If the wine and bread representing Christ's body bridge the gap between human and eternal, then what is the need for an intermediary in the form of a relic or saint? He then moves on to criticize the potentially blind worship afforded to some saints. What then can I say about men who have become illustrious elsewhere through the support of no evidence, but who, because of some men believe them to have been celebrated in some type of writing, prove especially elusive. What am I to make of one whose birth and whose life are known to none, but whose death is entirely obscure, though because of that death his praises are sung? And what would pray to those saints for help, when he does not know if they are merited anything from God? Doesn't a man's conscience cause grave offence if it calls as an intercessor before God someone who in fact offers no great hope? Surely the keenness of your prayer, more truly of your intention, grows dull when you do not know whether the one you pray to shares anything with God. The above is a very blunt and somewhat damaging statement to the thousands that place so much hope and faith in their idols, but without getting too theological, that in itself is the problem at hand. Guibert retains the belief that the former Byzantine iconoclasts did centuries before. Faith and worship should be directed to Christ and Christ alone, or at least to those who we know lived with piety, such as his apostles. As we will come to see, when sainthood gets out of control and twisted by fraud, there is a plethora of saints and relics, such as the tooth of Christ, that are simply too good to be true, and quite simply distract the worshipper from the main goal of salvation. Here we find a hint of modernity in Guibert's voice, as if he were a proto-scientist dispelling the work of God. It should be said, though, that his skepticism towards relics does not mean a rejection of Christianity or faith. Many contemporaries and predecessors analyse and criticise aspects of the Bible. Bede, for example, in the 8th century wrote an exegesis, an analysis or critique, on the story of Noah's Ark, where he attempted to rationalise the claims made within it, even rejecting some of the more far-fetched ones. As such, Guibert was not an unbeliever. Rather, he is concerned about these so-called pointless wonder works that were seemingly so widespread and distracting people from the true rewards of faith. Within miracle stories of saints, often readers will find very similar stories about deafness being cured, sailors being saved at sea, or the crippled being healed miraculously. Now, historians have said that either this could be a literary genre whereby, when writing the hagiographies of saints, churchmen would sprinkle such stories to play into the image of what a saint was believed to be capable of. Alternatively, it could have been a chicken and egg scenario, whereby these common stories occurred because that is what people sought from saints, and thus the more that these stories occurred, the more people went to saints with such afflictions. Nevertheless, Guibert also comments on this, with the following: that ever so wise abbot of Brittany and his religious monk saw it all and encouraged the contrived miracles, seduced by the piles of pilgrim gifts. Faint cases of deafness, pretended bouts of madness, fingers cunningly bent back to the palm, or feet contorted underneath the buttocks, can capture the avaricious hearts of the common mob. But why would a discreet and wise man, under the appearance of sanctity, make himself the promoter of such events? We have heard how such things are bandied about in repeated whispers, and have witnessed ridiculous deeds performed during the translation of reliquaries. And do we have seen the depths of another's purse daily emptied by the lies of whom Jerome calls enraged by the rage of their oratory? We are stirred by their adoration of the divine, such that, according to the aforesaid Father Jerome, they triumph on praying fools, spendthrifts, and plate liquors. In some ways, I'm not sure who Guibert is criticising more: the so-called stupidity of the pilgrims in falling for the false miracles of saints, or the clergymen themselves. Nevertheless, it is an insightful take on why we find so many common miracle stories within hagiographies. The introspection of Guibert leads to an incredibly insightful discussion whereby he attacks the heart of sainthood by asking, who exactly is a saint? Although we hold the apostles to be saints, as well as those whom the church has convincingly demonstrated to be martyrs, In the case of the confessors, we must take greater care in reaching a verdict. By their blood alone is the exaltation of martyrs justified. Even if we lacked sufficient written evidence about them, we do not inquire in the case of martyrs what sort of life they had led earlier, since blood is enough to purge them of oldest sins. This harks back to the story of St. Edmund the Martyr. Here we have a martyr who died for his kingdom and in a wider sense for Christianity, but did not ultimately live a pious life. Likewise with Gerald of Aurillac, the author jostles throughout as to whether the laity can or should be a saint. In Guibert's opinion, only those who lived a full life of piety should have the opportunity to become a saint. And in order to become one, there must be vast amounts of evidence about their virtues. He even goes on to say that people become envious of other patron saints and thus attempt to invent their own. We know, for instance, that in the case of St. Gerald, that the author did twist the truth to avoid certain questions about sanctity, and we shall come to find with the blood libel of St. William of Norwich that this is definitely true and did happen. What is particularly interesting about On the Relics of Saints is that Guibert uses figures from the past to elaborate on his perceptions, some of which have been featured in previous episodes. Not only does he discuss Suetonius, a Roman historian that was incredibly popular in the medieval era, but also Gregory the Great, who was the focus of a previous episode, and still relevant to our narrative centuries later. He states, as a rule, according to the Gregory the Great, when a person in disfavour is sent to intercede, the mind of the person who was angry only becomes angrier still, but all deny that they have chosen patrons who might be in this favour. Just let them explain to me how they believe their patron might protect them when they don't know anything about him. The only thing you can learn about him is his name, but if the clergy keeps silent, then old women and flocks of vile little ladies will chatter together, telling fictitious stories about their patrons, discussing them over their treadles and weavers' rods. Now, Guibert is extremely emotive in his critique, and it hints at a wider understanding of how miracle stories and the popularity of saints occurred. Gossip is a key in popularizing and maintaining a saint. Although hagiographies existed, we must remember that the general public simply could not read them, as they were produced in Latin, which was not the vernacular, and often a convoluted form that even historians today can struggle with. As such, gossip about healing or cures would travel along the pilgrim routes from village to town and capture the hearts of those who were desperate to be healed or cured. What Guibert fears, however, is that those who seek to poison this popularize stories about saints and relics that simply aren't true, and it is extremely insightful to understanding what source material was available in the 12th century for Guibert to reference Gregory the Great. He then references one such example of this fraud. There was a bishop of Bayeux named Odo, the illegitimate son of Count Robert of Normandy, a patrilineal brother of William the Elder, King of the English, who fervently searched for his saintly predecessor to the bishopric Exuperius. Odo paid £100 in coin to the guardian of the church where the saint had been taken, intending to remove the body from it, but instead, that wickedly clever guardian found a tomb in the present of a peasant named Exuperius, dug him up, and offered him to the bishop. The bishop asked whether these remains brought to him really did belong to Saint Exuperius, and even demanded that the guardian give him an oath. I swear to you, as a solemn oath, that this is the body of Exuperius about his sanctity. However, I will not swear, since that forename has been given to many men judged to have wandered far from sanctity. Tricked by this rogue, the bishop felt more at ease. The townspeople, however, learned about the profits that this custodian had made off of their patron. Just think how much shame this fraudulent episcopal double-dealing brought to all of religion. Even Abbot Suger of St-Denis was guilty of fraud and forgery to boost his own power, Suger built an enterprise of forging documents and traditions to link St-Denis to the Carolingian and Merovingian legends. In 1109, he commissioned and created a solemn liturgical ceremony to commemorate the memory of Dagobert, the first Frankish king who was buried at St-Denis. Furthermore, Suger emphasizes and writes about an ancient custom to sit on Dagobert's throne when receiving the first homages from the great lords of the realm, which reiterates the concept that the king was the apex of feudal kingship. Such emphasis on Dagobert provided longevity in the fidelity owed to St-Denis by kings. Ultimately, the point of Guibert makes within On Relics of Saints is that Christ has no need for physical memorials, as the Eucharist already fulfills this with the wine and bread representing body and blood. The supposed tooth, umbilical cord, or even foreskin of Christ were therefore useless and offered nothing to the pilgrim worshipper, and only signifies a growing corruption within the church that needed to be extinguished. As such, Guibert sought to limit the seemingly infinite power afforded to relics and saints in the 10th and 11th centuries, a reform that was part of a wider movement against the nature of power. Despite his fraudulent efforts, however, we also see such movement in the Vita Ludovici Regis, written by Abbot Suger. Now, much of the book has been explored in a previous episode, but there is another aspect of kingship that many who watched the coronation of King Charles III in May would have witnessed. That is, the king as a sacral figure. Even to those unfamiliar with medieval history, the concept of a divine right of rule is a well-known one that has endured and reoccurred through centuries of royal history. Now, interestingly, Suger does not describe any sacred consecration. Rather, he uses secular expressions of anointment and crowning. Suger states in the following chapter that Louis, king of the French by grace of God, could not put aside what he had grown accustomed to do in his youth, namely safeguarding the churches, protecting the poor, and working for the peace of the kingdom, which suggests a continuity between the before and after of the anointment. In the deeds, there is no record of a divine inspiration, thaumaturgical power, or royal touch that is bestowed to Louis once he becomes king. Now, this was all part of the 11th century reform of Pope Gregory VII. His tenure was a pivotal moment in the struggle of power between the papacy and secular rulers, as he sought to limit the authority of monarchs and establish the primacy of the church. Known as the Gregorian reforms, these would cause ripples throughout Europe as a result of conflicts with emperors and kings alike. Now, Guibert's critique of the relics and Suger's deeds are part of this collective intellectual reform movement in the 12th century that focused on one thing: power. There was a Gregorian war cry for freedom within the church to separate itself, as it used to be in the age of Justinian, and return to a more primitive church. They sought to reshuffle the resources within Europe and attack the idea of synonymy and heresy that was being upheld by power. Now, underpinned by paranoia, contemporaries sought to limit spiritual power from the perceptions of kingship, as they believed it allowed kings to enslave the papacy and clergy. As the church and papacy were forever growing in power and domination within Europe, there was continuous tension within itself, as well as with secular powers, over the nature of primacy. Quite simply, the later Middle Ages was a free-for-all, but it was this mobility in the power that would later lead the church to flourish and later fall. And so there we have it, the story of Guibert of Nogent, the relics on saints, and the Gregorian reforms. Thank you.